Evangeline, A Tale of Acadie by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, read by mickeygemineye. Evangeline, Part 1. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, bearded with moss and in garments green and distinct in the twilight, stand like druids of eld with voices sad and prophetic, stand like harpers hoar with beards that rest on their bosoms. Loud from its rocky caverns the deep-voiced neighboring ocean speaks, and an ancient disconsolate answers the wail of the forest. This is the forest primeval, where are the hearts that beneath it leaped like the roe when he hears in the woodland the voice
Where
of
is
the
the
huntsman.
thatched roof village, the home of Acadian farmers, men whose lives gilded unlike rivers that water the woodlands, darkened by shadows of earth, but reflecting an image of heaven. Waste are those pleasant farms, and the farmers forever departed, scattered like dust and leaves when the mighty blasts of October seize them, and whirl them aloft, and sprinkle them far o'er the ocean. Naught but tradition remains of the beautiful village of Grand Prix. Ye who believe in affection that hopes and endures and is patient, ye who believe in the beauty and strength of woman's devotion, list to the mournful tradition still sung by the pines of the forest. List to a tale of love in Acadie, home of the happy. In the Acadian land on the shores of the basin of Minas, distant, secluded, still, the village of Grand Prix lay in the fruitful valley. Vast meadows stretched to the eastward, giving the village its name, and a pasture to flocks without number. Dikes that the hands of the farmers had raised with labor incessant shut out the turbulent tides. But at stated seasons the floodgates opened and welcomed the sea to wander at will over the meadows. West and south there were fields of flax and orchards and cornfields, spreading afar and unfenced over the plain, and away to the northward Blomidon rose, and the forests old, and aloft on the mountains sea fogs pitched their tents, and mists from the mighty Atlantic looked on the happy valley, but ne'er from their station descended. There, in the midst of its farms, reposed the Acadian village. Strongly built were the houses, with frames of oak and of chestnut, such as the peasants of Normandy built in the reign of the Henrys. Thatched were the roofs, with dormer windows and gables projecting over the basement below, protected and shaded the doorway. There, in the tranquil evenings of summer, when brightly the sunset lighted the village street and gilded the vanes of the chimneys, matrons and maidens sat in snow-white caps and in kirtles, scarlet and blue and green, with the staff spinning the golden flax for their gossiping looms, whose noisy shuttles within doors mingled their sound with the whir of the wheels and the songs of the maidens. Solemnly down the street came the parish priest, and the children paused in their play to kiss the hand he extended to bless them. Reverend walked he among them, and up rose matrons and maidens, hailing his slow approach with words of affectionate welcome. Then came the laborers home from the field, and serenely the sun sank down to his rest, and twilight prevailed. Anon from the belfry softly the angelus sounded, and over the roofs of the village columns of pale blue smoke, like clouds of incense ascending, rose from 100 hearths the homes of peace and contentment, that thus dwelled together in love. These simple Acadian farmers dwelt in the love of God and of man. Alike were they free from fear that reigns with the tyrant and envy, the vice of republics. Neither locks had they to their doors, nor bars to their windows, but their dwellings were open as day, and the hearts of the owners. There the richest was poor, and the poorest lived in abundance. Somewhat apart from the village, and nearer the basin of Minas, Benedict Bellefontaine, the wealthiest farmer of Grand Pré, dwelt on his goodly acres, and with him, directing his household, gentle Evangeline lived, his child, and the pride of the village. Stalwart and stately in form was the man of 70 winters. Hearty and hale was he, in oak that is covered with snowflakes, while as these snow were his locks, and his cheeks as brown as the oak leaves. Fair was she to behold, that maiden of 17 summers. Black were her eyes as the berry that grows on the thorn by the wayside. Black, yet how softly they gleam beneath the brown shade of her trestles. Sweet was her breath as the breath of kine that feed in the meadows, when in the harvest heat she bore to the reapers at noontide flagons that home-brewed ale. Fair in sooth was the maiden, fair was she when on Sunday morn, while the bell from its turret sprinkled with holy sounds the air, as the priest with his hyssop sprinkles the congregation and scatters blessings upon them. Down the long street she passed, with her chaplet of beads and her missal. Fair in sooth was the maiden, fair was she when on Sunday morn, bell from his turret sprinkled with holy sounds the air, as the priest with his hyssop sprinkles the congregation and scatters blessings upon them. Down the long street she passed, with her chaplet of beads and her missal, wearing her Norman cap and her kirtle of blue, and the earrings brought in the olden time from France, and since as an heirloom, handed down from mother to child through long generations. But a celestial brightness, a more ethereal beauty, shone on her face and encircled her form when, after confession, homeward, serenely, she walked with God's benediction upon her. When she had passed, it seemed like the ceasing of exquisite music. Firmly builded with rafters of oak, the house of the farmer stood on the side of a hill, commanding the sea, and a shady sycamore grew by the door with a woodbine wreathing around it. Rudely carved was the porch with her seats beneath, and a footpath led through an orchard wide and disappeared in the meadow. Under the sycamore tree were hives overhung by a penthouse, such as the traveler sees in regions remote by the roadside, built o'er a box for the poor, or the blessed image of Mary. Farther down on the slope of the hill was the well, with its moss-grown bucket fastened with iron, and near it a trough for the horses. Shielding the house from storms on the north were the barns and the farmyard. There stood the broad-wheeled wains and the antique plows and the harrows. There was the folds for the sheep, and there in his feathered seraglio strutted with lordly turkey and crowned the cock with the self-same voice that in ages of old had startled the penitent Peter. Bursting with hay were the barns, themselves a village, and each one, far over the gable, projected a roof of thatch, and a staircase under the sheltering eaves led up to the odorous corn loft. There, too, the dovecot stood, with its meek and innocent inmates murmuring over ever of love, while above in the variant breeze numberless noisy weathercocks rattled and sang of mutation. Thus, at peace with God and the world, the farmer of Grand Pré lived on his sunny farm, and Evangeline governed his household. Many a youth, as he knelt in the church and opened his missal, fixed his eyes upon her as the saint of the deepest devotion. Happy was he who met, touched her hand on the hem of her garment. Many a soldier came to her door by the darkness befriended, and as he knocked and waited to hear the sound of her footsteps, knew not which beat the louder, his heart or the knocker of iron, or at the joyous feast of the patron saint of the village, bolder grew, and pressed her hand in the dance as he whispered hurried words of love that seemed a part of the music. But among all who came, young Gabriel only was welcome. Gabriel Lajeunesse, the son of Basil the blacksmith, who was a mighty man in the village and honored of all men. For since the birth of time, throughout all ages and nations, has the craft of the smith been held in repute by the people. Basil was Benedict's friend. Their children from earliest childhood grew up together as brother and sister, and Father Felician, priest and pedagogy, both in the village, had taught them their letters out of the self-same book, with the hymns of the church and the plain song. But when the hymn was sung and the daily lesson completed, swiftly they hurried away to the forge of Basil the blacksmith. There at the door they stood with wondering eyes to behold him take in his lathern lap the hoof of the horse as a plaything, nailing the shoe in its place, while near him the tire of the cartwheel lay like a fiery snake, coiled round in a circle of cinders. Oft on autumnal eves, when without in the gathering darkness, bursting with light, seemed the smithy through every cranny and crevice, warmed by the forge within, they watched the laboring bellows, and as its panting ceased and the sparks expired in the ashes, merrily laughed and said they were nuns going into the chapel. Oft on sledges in winter, as swift as the swoop of the eagle, down the hillside bounding, they glided away o'er the meadow. Oft in the barns they climbed to the populous nests of the rafters, seeking with eager eyes that wondrous stone with which the swallow brings from the shore of the sea to restore the sight of its fledglings. Lucky was he who found that stone in the nest of the swallow. Thus passed a few swift years, and they no longer were children. He was a variant youth, and his face, like the face of the morning, glad in the earth, with its light ripened through into action, She was a woman now, with the heart and hopes of a woman. Sunshine of St. Eulalie was she called, for that was the sunshine which, as farmers believed, would load their orchards with apples. She too would bring to her husband's house delight and abundance, filling it full of love and the ruddy faces of children. Part 2. Now had the season returned when the nights grow colder and longer, and the retreating sun, the sign of the scorpion, enters. Birds of passage sailed through the laden air from the ice-bound, desolate northern bays to the shores of tropical islands. Harvests were gathered in, and wild with the winds of September wrestled the trees of the forest as Jacob of old with the angel. All the signs foretold a winter long and inclement. Bees and prophetic instinct had hoarded their honey, till the hives overflowed, and the Indian hunters asserted cold would the winter be, for thick was the fur of the foxes. Such was the advent of autumn. Then followed this beautiful season called the pious Acadian peasants, the summer of all saints. Filled was the air with a dreamy and magical light, and the landscape lay as if now created in all the freshness of childhood. Peace seemed to reign upon the earth, and the restless heart of the ocean was for a moment consoled. All sounds were in harmony blended. Voices of children at play, the crowing of cocks in the farmyards, whir of wings in the drowsy air, and the cooing of pigeons. All were subdued and low as the murmurs of love, and the great sun looked with the eye of love through the golden vapors around him, while arrayed in his robes of russet and scarlet and yellow, bright with the sheen of the dew, each glittering tree of the forest flashed like the pine tree, the Persian adorned with mantles and jewels. Now recommenced the reign of rest and affection and stillness. Day, with its burden and heat, has departed, and twilight descending, brought back the evening star to the sky, and the herds to be the homestead. Pawing the ground they came, and resting their necks on each other, and with their nostrils distended, inhaling the freshness of evening. Foremost, bearing the bell, Evangeline's beautiful heifer, proud of her snow-white hide and the ribbon that waved from her collar, quietly paced and slow, as if conscious of human affection. Then came the shepherd's back, with his bleating flocks from the seaside, where was their favorite pasture. Behind them followed the watchdog, patient, full of importance, and grand in the pride of his instinct, walking from side to side with a lordly air, and superbly waving his bushy tail and urging forward the stragglers. Regent of flocks was he, went the shepherd, slept their protector. When from the forest at night, through the starry silence, the wolves howled. Late with the rising moon, returned the wains from the marshes, laden with briny hay. That filled the air with its odor. Surely neighed the steeds with dew on their manes and their fetlocks, while aloft on their shoulders the wooden and ponderous saddles, painted with brilliant dyes and adorned with tassels of crimson, nodding in a bright array like hollyhocks heavy and with blossoms. Patiently stood the cows meanwhile, and yielding their udders unto the milkmaid's hand, whilst loud and in regular cadence into the sounding pails the foaming streamlets descended. Lowing of cattle and peals of laughter were heard in the farmyard, echoes back by the barns. Anon they sank into stillness heavily closed with a jarring sound. The valves of the barn doors rattled with the wooden bars, and all for a season was silent. Indoors, warmed by the wide-mouthed fireplace, idly the farmer sat in his elbow chair and watched how the flames and the smoke wreaths struggled together like foes in a burning city. Behind him, nodding and mocking along the wall with gestures fantastic, darted his own huge shadow and vanished away into the darkness. Faces clumsily carved in oak on the back of his armchair laughed in the flickering light, and the pewter plates on the dresser caught and reflected the flame, as shields of armies the sunshine. Fragments of song the old man sang, and carols of Christmas such as at home in the olden time his fathers before him sang in their Norman orchards and bright Burgundian vineyards. Close at her father's side was the gentle Evangeline seated, spinning flax for the loom that stood in the corner behind her, silent a while where its treadles, at rest was its diligent shuttle, while the monotonous drone of the wheel, like the drone of a bagpipe, followed the old man's song, and united the fragments together. As in a church, when the chant of the choir at intervals ceases, footfalls are heard in the aisles of words, or the priest at the altar, so in each pause of the song, with measured motion, the clock clicked. Thus as they sat, there was footsteps heard, and suddenly lifted, sounded the wooden latch, and the door swung back on its hinges. Benedict knew by the hobnailed shoes it was Basil the blacksmith, and by her beating heart Evangeline knew who was with him. "Welcome," the farmer exclaimed, as their footsteps paused on the threshold. "Welcome, Basil, my friend. Come, take the place on the settle close by the chimney side, which is always empty without thee. Take from the shelf overhead thy pipe and the box of tobacco. Never so much thyself art thou, as when through the curdling smokes of pipe of the forge thy friendly and jovial face gleams, round and red as the harvest moon through the mist of the marshes." Then with a smile of content thus answered Basil the blacksmith, taking with easy air the accustomed seat by the fireside. "Benedict Bellefontaine, thou hast ever thy jest and thy ballad. Ever in cheerfulest mood art thou, when others are filled with gloomy forebodings of ill, and see only ruin before them. Happy art thou, as if every day thou hadst picked up a horseshoe." Pausing for a moment to take the pipe that Evangeline brought him. 4 days now are past since the English ships at their anchors ride in the Gaspereau's mouth with their cannon pointed against us. What their design may be is unknown, but all are commanded, or the marrow to meet in the church, where His Majesty's mandate will be proclaimed as law in the land. Alas, in the meantime, many surmises of evil alarm the hearts of the people. Then made answer the farmer, "Perhaps some friendlier purpose brings these ships to our shores. Perhaps the harvests in England by ultimately rains of ultimately heat have been blighted, and from our bursting barns they would feed their cattle and children. Not so thinketh the folk in the village," said warmly the blacksmith, shaking his head as in doubt. Then, Heaving a sigh, he continued, Louisburg is not forgotten, nor Beauséjour, nor Port Royal. Many already have fled to the forest and lurk on its outskirts, walking with anxious hearts the dubious fate of tomorrow. Arms have been taken from us, and warlike weapons of all kinds. Nothing is left but the blacksmith's sledge and the scythe of the mower. Then, with a pleasant smile, made answer the jovial farmer, Safer are we unarmed, in the midst of our flocks and our cornfields. Safer within these peaceful dikes besieged by the ocean than our fathers and forts besieged by the enemy's cannon. Fear no evil, my friend, and tonight may no shadow of sorrow fall on this house and hearth, for this is the night of the contract. Built are the house and the barn. The merry lads of the village strongly have built them and well, and breaking the clay around about, filled the barn with hay, and the house with food for a 12-month. Rene LeBlanc will be here soon, anon, with the papers and inkhorn. Shall we not then be glad and rejoice in the joy of our children? As apart by the window she stood, with her hand in her lover's, blushing, Evangeline heard the words that her father had spoken, and as she died on his lips, the worthy notary entered. Bent like a laboring oar that toils in the surf of the ocean. Bent but not broken by age was the form of the notary public. Shocks of yellow hair, like the silken floss of the maize, hung over his shoulders. His forehead was high, and glasses with horn bows sat astride on his nose, with a look of wisdom supernal. Father of 20 children was he, and more than 100 children's children rode on his knee, and heard his great watch tick. 4 long years, in the times of the war, had he languished a captive, suffering much in an old French fort as the friend of the English. Now, though warrior grown, without all guile or suspicion, ripe in wisdom was he, but patient and simple and childlike. He was beloved by all, and most of all by the children, for he told them tales of the loup-garou in the forest, and of the goblin that came in the night to water the horses, and of the white Littich, the ghost of a child who unchristened died, and was doomed to haunt unseen the chambers of children, and how on Christmas Eve the oxen talked in the stable, and how the fever was cured by a spider shut up in a nutshell, and of the marvelous powers of 4-leaf clover and horseshoes, with whatsoever else was written the lore of the village. Then uprose from his seat by the fireside Basil the blacksmith, knocked from his pipe the ashes, and slowly extending his right hand, "Father LeBlanc," he exclaimed, "thou hast heard the talk in the village, and perchance canst tell us some news of these ships and their errands." Then, with modest demeanor, made answer the notary public, "Gossip enough have I heard, in sooth, yet am never the wiser, and what their errand may be I know not better than others. Yet am I not of those who imagine some evil intention brings them here, for we are at peace, and why then molest us?" "God's name!" shouted the hasty and somewhat irascible blacksmith. "Must we in all things look for the how and the why and the wherefore? Daily injustice is done, might is right of the strongest." But without heeding his warmth, continued the notary public, "Man is unjust, but God is just. Finally, justice triumphs. And well, I remember a story that often consoled me. When as a captive I lay in the old French fort at Port Royal. When as a captive I lay in the old French fort at Port Royal, This was the old man's favorite tale, and he loved to repeat it when his neighbors complained that any injustice was done them. Once in an ancient city whose name I no longer remember, raised aloft on a column, a brazen statue of justice stood in the public square, upholding the scales in his left hand, and in its right a sword as an emblem that justice presided over the laws of the land and the hearts and homes of the people. Even the birds had built their nests in the scales of the balance, having no fear of the sword that flashed in the sunshine above them. But in the course of time, the laws of the land were corrupted. Might took the place of right, and weak were oppressed, and the mighty ruled with an iron rod. Then it chanced in a nobleman's palace that a necklace of pearls was lost, and ere long a suspicion fell on an orphan girl who lived as maid in the household. She, after form of trial condemned to die on the scaffold, patiently met her doom at the foot of the statue of justice. As to her father in heaven, her innocent spirit ascended. Lo! Over the city a tempest rose, and the bolts of the thunder smote the statue of bronze, and hurried in wrath from its left hand. Down on the pavement below the clattering scales of the balance, and in the hollow thereof was found the nest of a magpie, into whose clay-built walls the necklace of pearls was inwoven. Silenced, but not convinced, when the story was ended, the blacksmith stood like a man who fain would speak, but findeth no language. All his thoughts were congealed into lines on his face, as the vapors freeze in fantastic shapes on the window panes in the winter. Then Evangeline lighted the brazen lamp on the table, filled it till it overflowed, the pewter tankard with the home-brewed nut-brown ale that was famed for its strength in the village of the Grand Pré, while from his pocket the notary drew his papers and inkhorn, wrote with a steady hand the date and the age of the parties, naming the dower of the bride and flocks of sheep and cattle. Orderly all things proceeded, and duly and well were completed, and the great seal of the law was set like a sun on the margin. Then, from his leathern pouch, the farmer threw on the table 3 times the old man's fee in solid pieces of silver, and the notary, rising and blessing the bride and the bridegroom, lifted aloft the tankard of ale and drank to their welfare. Wiping the foam from his lip, he solemnly bowed and departed, while in silence the others sat and mused by the fireside, till Evangeline brought the draught board out of its corner. Soon was the game begun, and friendly contention the old man laughed and ate each lucky hit, or unsuccessful maneuver. Laughed when a man crowned or a breach was made in the king row. Meanwhile, apart in the twilight gloom of a window's embrasure, sat the lovers and whispered together, beholding the moon rise over the pallid sea and silvery mist of the meadows. Silently, one by one, in the infinite meadows of heaven, blossomed the lovely stars, the forget-me-nots of the angels. Thus passed the evening away. Anon, the bell from the belfry rang out the hour of 9, the village curfew, and straightway rose the guests and departed, and silence resigned in the household. Many a farewell word and sweet good night on the doorstep lingered long in Evangeline's heart and filled it with gladness. Carefully then were covered the embers that glowed on the hearthstone, and on the oaken stairs resounded the tread of the farmer. Soon, with a soundless step, the foot of Evangeline followed. Up the staircase moved a luminous space in the darkness, lighted less by the lamp than the shining face of the maiden. Silent she passed through the hall and entered the door of her chamber. Simple that chamber was, with its curtains of white and its cloths pressed ample and high, on whose spacious shelves were carefully folded linen and woolen stuffs by the hand of Evangeline woven. This was the precious dower she would bring to her husband in marriage. But then flocks and herds being proofs of her skill as an housewife. Soon she extinguished her lamp, for the mellow and radiant moonlight streamed through the windows and lighted the room, till the heart of the maiden swelled and obeyed its power like the tremulous tides of the ocean. Ah, she was fair, exceeding fair to behold, as she stood with naked snow-white feet on the gleaming floor of her chamber. Little she dreamed that below, among the trees of the orchard, waited her lover and watched for the gleam of her lamp and her shadow. Yet were her thoughts of him, and at times a feeling of sadness passed o'er her soul as a sailing shade of clouds in the moonlight flitted across the floor and darkened the room for a moment. And as she gazed from the window, she saw serenely the moon pass forth from the folds of a cloud, and one star follow her footsteps, as out of Abraham's tent young Ishmael wandered her with Hagar. 4. Pleasantly rose next morn the sun on the village of Grand Pre. Pleasantly gleamed in the soft, sweet air the basin of Minos, where the ships with their wavering shadows were riding at anchor. Life had long been astir in the village, and clamorous labor knocked with its 100 hands at the golden gates of the morning. Now from the country around, from the farms and the neighboring hamlets, came in their holiday dresses the blithe Acadian peasants. Many a glad gemaro and jocund laugh from the young folk made the bright air brighter, as up from the numerous meadows, where no path could be seen but the track of wheels, and the greensward group after group appeared and joined or passed on the highway, long ere noon, and the village all sounds of labor were silenced. Thronged were the streets with people, and noisy groups at the house doors sat in the cheerful sun and rejoiced and gossiped together. Every house was an inn, where all were welcomed and feasted. For with this simple people who lived like brothers together, all things were held in common, and what one had was another's. Yet under Benedict's roof hospitality seemed more abundant. For Evangeline stood among the guests of her father. Bright was her face with smiles, and words of welcome and gladness fell from her beautiful lips and blessed the cup as she gave it. Under the open sky and the odorous air of the orchard, bending with golden fruit, was spread the feast of betrothal. There in the shade of the porch were the priest and the notary seated. There good Benedict sat, and sturdy Basil the blacksmith. Not far withdrawn from these, by the cider press and the beehives, Michael, the fiddler, was placed, with the gayest of arts and of waistcoats. Shadow and light from the leaves alternately played on his snow-white hair, as it waved in the wind, and the jolly face of the fiddler glowed like a living coal when the ashes are blown from the embers. Gaily the old man sang to the vibrant sound of his fiddle, tous les bourgeois de Chartres and les carillons de Duncre. And anon with his wooden shoes beat time to the music. Merrily, merrily whirled the wheels of dizzying dances. Under the orchard trees and down the path to the meadows, old folk and young together, and children mingled among them. Fairest of all the maids was Evangeline, Benedict's daughter. Noblest of all the youths was Gabriel, son of the blacksmith. So passed the morning away, and lo, with a summons sonorous, sounded the bell from its tower, and over the meadows a drum beat. Thronged ere long was the church with men. Without in the churchyard waited the women. They stood by the graves and hung on the headstones. garlands of autumn leaves and evergreens, fresh from the forest. Then came the guard from the ships, and marching proudly among them, entered the sacred portal. With loud and dissonant clangor echoed the sound of their brazen drums from ceiling and casement. Echoed a moment only, and slowly the ponderous portal closed, and in silence the crowd awaited the will of the soldiers. Then uprose the commander, and spake from the steps of the altar, holding aloft his hands with its seals the royal commission. "You are convened this day," he said, "by his majesty's orders. Clement and kind has he been, but how you have answered his kindness, let your own hearts reply. To my natural make and my temper, painful the task is I do, which to you I know must be grievous. Yet must I bow and obey and deliver the will of our monarch, namely, that all your lands and dwellings and cattle of all kinds forfeited be to the crown, and that you yourselves from this providence be transported to other lands. God grant you may dwell there ever as the faithful subjects, a happy and peaceable people. Prisoners now I declare you, for such is his majesty's pleasure." As when the air is serene and the sultry solstice of summer suddenly gathers a storm, and the deadly sling of the hailstones beats down on the farmer's corn in the field and shatters his windows, hiding the sun, strewing the ground with thatch from the house roofs, bellowing fly the herds, and seek to break their enclosures. So on the hearts of people descended the words of the speaker. Silent a moment they stood in speechless wonder, and then rose louder and ever louder a wall of sorrow and anger. And by one impulse moved, they madly rushed to the doorway. Vain was the hope of escape, and cries and fierce imprecations rang through the house of prayer, and high o'er the heads of the others rose, with his arms uplifted, the figure of Basil the blacksmith. As on a stormy sea, a spar is tossed by the billows. Flushed was his face, and distorted with passion, and wildly he shouted, "Down with the tyrants of England, we never have sworn them allegiance. Death to these foreign soldiers who seize on our homes and on our harvests." More he fain would have said, but the merciless hand of a soldier smote him upon the mouth and dragged him down to the pavement. In the midst of the strife and tumult of angry contention, lo, the door of the chancel opened, and Father Felician entered with serious mien, and ascended the steps of the altar. Raising his reverent hand, with a gesture he awed into silence all that clamorous throng, and thus he spake to his people. Deep were his tones, and solemn in accents, measured and mournful, spake he as, after the tocsin's alarum, distinctly the clock strikes. "What is this that ye do, my children? What madness has seized you? 40 years of my life have I labored among you, and taught you, not in word alone, but in deed to love one another. And this, the fruit of my toils, of my vigils and prayers and privations, have you so soon forgotten all lessons of love and forgiveness? This is the house of the Prince of Peace, or would you profane it thus with violent deeds and hearts overflowing with hatred? Lo, where he crucified Christ from his cross is gazing upon you. See, and those more sorrowful eyes with meekness and holy compassion. Hark, how those lips still repeat. Let us repeat it now, and say, O Father, forgive them. Few were his words of rebuke, but deep in the hearts of his people sank they, and sobs of contrition succeeded that passion outbreak. And they repeated his prayer and said, O Father, forgive them. Then came the evening service. The tapers gleamed from the altar. Fervent and deep was the voice of the priest, and the people responded, not with their lips alone, but their hearts. And the Ave Maria sang they, and fell on their knees, and their souls, with devotion translated, rose and the ardor of prayer like Elijah ascending to heaven. Meanwhile had spread in the village the tidings of ill, and on all sides wandered wailing. From house to house the women and children. Long at her father's door Evangeline stood, with her right hand shielding her eyes from the level rays of the sun that, descending, lighted the village street with mysterious splendor, and roofed each peasant's cottage with golden thatch, and emblazoned its windows. Long within had been spread the snow-white cloth on the table. There stood the wheaten loaf, and the honey fragrant with wild flowers. There stood the tankard of ale, and the cheese, fresh brought from the dairy. And at the head of the board the great armchair of the farmer. Thus did Evangeline wait at her father's door, as the sun set through the long shadows of the trees o'er the broad ambrosial meadows. On her spirit with a deeper shadow had fallen, and from the fields of her soul a fragrance celestial ascended. Charity, meekness, love, and hope, and forgiveness, and patience. Then, all forgetful of self, she wandered into the village, cheering with looks and words the disconsolate hearts of the women, as o'er the darkening fields with lingering steps they departed, urged by their household cares, and the weary feet of their children. Down sank the great red sun, and in golden glimmering vapors veiled the light of his face, like the prophet descending from Sinai. Sweetly over the village the bear of the Angelus sounded. Meanwhile, amid the gloom by the church, Evangeline lingered. All was silent within, and in vain at the door and the windows stood she, and listened and looked until, overcome by emotion, "Gabriel!" cried she aloud with tremulous voice, but no answer came from the graves of the dead, nor the gloomier grave of the living. Slowly, at length, she returned to the tenantless house of her father. Smoldered the fire on the hearth, on the board stood the supper untasted. Empty and drear was each room, and haunted with phantoms of terror. Sadly echoed her step on the stair and the floor of her chamber. In the dead of the night she heard the whispering rain fall loud on the withered leaves of the sycamore tree by the window. Keenly the lightning flashed, and the voice of the echoing thunder told her that God was in heaven, and governed the world he created. Then she remembered the tales she had heard of the justice of heaven. Soothed was her troubled soul, and she peacefully slumbered till morning. 5. 4 times the sun had risen and set, and now on the 5th day cheerily called the cock to the sleeping maids of the farmhouse. Soon over the yellow fields in silent and mournful procession came from the neighboring hamlets and farms the Acadian women, driving in ponderous wains their household goods to the seashore, pausing and looking back to gaze once more on their dwellings ere they were shut from sight by the winding road and the woodland. Close at their sides their children ran and urged on the oxen, while in their little hands they clasped some fragments of playthings. But with a smile and a sigh she clasped his neck and embraced him, speaking words of endearment where words of comfort were availed not. Thus too the Gasper's mouth moved on that mournful procession. There disorder prevailed, and the tumult and stir of embarking. Busily piled the freighted boats, and in the confusion wives were torn from their husbands, and mothers too late saw their children left on the land, extending their arms with wildest entreaties. So unto separate ships were Basil and Gabriel carried, while in despair on the shore Evangeline stood with her father. Half the task was not done when the sun went down, and the twilight deepened and darkened around, and in haste the refluent ocean fled away from the shore, and left the line on the sand beach covered with wharfs of the tide, with kelp and the slippery seaweed. Farther back in the midst of the household goods in the wagons, like to a gypsy camp or a leaguer after a battle, all escaped, cut off by the sea, and the sentinels near them lay encamped for the night, the houseless Acadian farmers. Back to its nethermost caves retreated the bellowing ocean, dragging adown the beach the rattled pebbles, and leaving inland and far up the shore the stranded boats and the sailors. Then, as the night descended, the herds returned from their pastures. Sweet was the moist, still air, with the odor of milk from their udders. Lowing, they waited and long at the well-known bars of the farmyard, waited and looked in vain for the voice and the hand of the milkmaid. Silence resigned reigned in the streets. From the church no angelus sounded, rose no smoke from the roofs, and gleamed no lights from the windows. But on the shores, meanwhile, the evening fires had been kindled, built of the driftwood thrown on the sands from wrecks in the tempest. Round them, shapes of gloom and sorrowful faces were gathered. Voices of women were heard, and of men, and the crying of children. Onward from fire to fire, as from hearth to hearth in his parish, wandered the faithful priest, consoling and blessing and cheering, like unto shipwrecked Paul or Milia's desolate seashore. Thus he approached the place where Evangeline sat with her father, and in the flickering light beheld the face of the old man, haggard and hollow and worn, and without either thought or emotion, e'en as the face of the clock from which the hands have been taken. Vainly Evangeline strove with words and careless caresses to cheer him. Vainly offered him food, yet he moved not, he looked not, he spake not, but with a vacant stare ever gazed at the flickering firelight. Benedicite, murmured the priest in tones of compassion. More he fain would have said, but his heart was full, and his accents faltered and paused on his lips as the feet of a child on the threshold, hushed by the scene that he beholds and the awful presence of sorrow. Silently, therefore, he laid his hand on the head of the maiden, raising his eyes full of tears to the silent stars that above them moved on their way, unperturbed by the wrongings and sorrows of mortals. Then sat he down at her side, and they wept together in silence. Suddenly rose from the south a light, as in autumn the blood-red moon climbs the crystal walls of heaven, and o'er the horizon Titan-like stretches its 100 hands upon mountain and meadow, seizing the rocks and the rivers, and piling huge shadows together. Broader and ever broader it gleamed on the roofs of the village, gleamed on the sky and the sea, and the ships that lay in the roadstead. Columns of shining smoke uprose, and flashes of flame were thrust through their folds and withdrawn, like the quivering hands of a martyr. Then, as the wind seized the gleeds and the burning thatch, and uplifting, whirled them aloft through the air, at once from 100 housetops started the sheeting smoke with flashes of flame intermingled. These things beheld in dismay the crowd on the shore and on shipboard. Speechless at first they stood, then cried aloud in their anguish, "We shall behold no more our homes in the village of Grand Pré." Loud on a sudden the cocks began to crow in the farmyards, thinking the day had dawned, and anon the lowing of cattle came on the evening breeze, by the barking of dogs interrupted. Then rose a sound of dread, such as startles the sleeping encampments far in the western prairies or forests that skirt the Nebraska. When the wild horses, affrighted, sweep by the speed of the whirlwind,
or the loud bellowing herds of buffaloes rushed to the river. Such was the sound that arose on that night, as the herds and the horses broke through their folds and fences, and madly rushed over the meadows. Overwhelmed with the sight, yet speechless, the priest and the maiden gazed on the scene of terror that reddened and widened before them. As they turned at length to speak to their silent companion, lo, from his seat he had fallen, and stretched abroad on the seashore. Motionless lay his form from which the soul had departed. Slowly the priest uplifted the lifeless head, and the maiden knelt at her father's side and wailed aloud in her terror. Then in a swoon she sank and lay with her head on his bosom. Through the long night she lay in deep, oblivious slumber, and when she awoke from the trance, she beheld a multitude near her. Faces and hands she beheld, that were mournfully gazing upon her, pallid, with tearful eyes and looks of saddest compassion. Still the blaze of the burning village illumined the landscape, reddened the sky overhead, and gleamed on the faces around her. And like the day of doom, it seemed to her wavering senses. Then a familiar voice she heard as it said to the people, "Let us bury him by the sea, when a happier season brings us again to our homes from the unknown land of our exile. Then shall his sacred dust be piously laid in the churchyard." Such were the words of the priest, and there in haste by the seaside, having the glare of the burning village for funeral torches, but without bell or book, they buried the farmer at Grand Prairie. And as the voice of the priest repeated the service of sorrow, lo, with a mournful sound, like the voice of a vast congregation, solemnly answered the sea and mingled its roar with the dirges. Tea was the returning tide that afar from the waste of the ocean, with the first dawn of the day, came heaving and hurrying landward, then recommenced once more the stir and noise of embarking, and with the ebb of that tide the ships sailed out of the harbor, leaving behind them the dead on the shore and the village in ruins. Part the second. 1. Many a weary year had passed since the burning of Grand Prairie, when on the falling tide the freighted vessels departed, bearing the nation with all its household gods into exile. Exile without an end and without an example in history. Far asunder on separate coasts the Acadians landed. Scattered were they, like flakes of snow when the wind from the northeast strikes assailant through the fogs that darken the banks of Newfoundland. Friendless, homeless, hopeless, they wandered from city to city, from the cold lakes of the north to sultry southern savannas, from the bleak shores of the sea to the lands where the Father of Waters seizes the hills in his hands and drags them down to the ocean, deep in their sands to bury the scattered bones of the mammoth. Friends they sought, and homes, and many, despairing, heartbroken, asked of the earth but a grave, and no longer a friend nor a fireside. Written their history stands on tablets of stone in the churchyards. Long among them was seen a maiden who waited and wandered, lowly and meek in spirit, patiently suffering all things. Fair was she and young, but alas, before her extended dreary and vast and silent the desert of life, with its pathway marked by the graves of those who had sorrowed and suffered before. Passions long extinguished and hopes long dead and abandoned, as the emigrant's way o'er the western desert is marked by campfires long consumed and bones that bleach in sunshine. Something there was in her life incomplete, imperfect, unfinished, as if a morning of June was, with all its music and sunshine, suddenly paused in the sky and, fading, slowly descended into the east again, from whence it late had arisen. Sometimes she lingered in towns till, urged by the fever within her, Urged by restless longing, the hunger and thirst of the spirit, she would commence again her endless search and endeavor. Sometimes in churchyards strayed and gazed on the crosses and tombstones, sat by some nameless grave and thought that perhaps in its bosom he was already at rest, and she longed to slumber beside him. Sometimes a rumor, a hearsay, an inarticulate whisper came with its airy hand to point and beckon her forward. Sometimes she spake with those who had seen her beloved and known him, but it was long ago in some far-off place or forgotten. "Gabriel le Jeunesse," said they. "Oh yes, we have seen him. He was with Basil the blacksmith, and both have gone to the prairies. Coureurs des bois, they, and famous hunters and trappers." "Gabriel le Jeunesse," said others. "Oh yes, we have seen him. He is a voyager in the lowlands of Louisiana." Then would they say, "Dear child, why dream and wait for him longer? Are there not other youths as fair as Gabriel, others who have hearts as tender and true, and spirits as loyal? Here is Baptiste Leblanc, the notary's son, who has loved thee many a tedious year. Come, give him thy hand and be happy. Thou art too fair to be left to braid St. Catherine's tresses." Then would Evangeline answer serenely but sadly, "I cannot. Whither my heart is gone, there follows my hand, and not elsewhere. For when the heart goes before like a lamp and illumines the pathway, many things are made clear that else lie hidden in darkness." Thereupon the priest, her friend and father confessor, said with a smile, "O daughter, thy God thus speaketh within thee. Talk not of wasted affection. Affection never was wasted. If it enrich not the heart of another, its waters, returning back to their springs like the rain, shall fill them full of refreshment. That which the fountain sends forth returns again to the fountain. Patience, accomplish thy labor, accomplish thy work of affection. Silence and sorrow are strong, and patience and endurance is godlike. Therefore accomplish thy labor of love till the heart is made godlike, purified, strengthened, perfected, and rendered more worthy of heaven." Cheered by the good man's words, Evangeline labored and waited. Still in her heart she heard the funeral dirge of the ocean, but with its sound there was mingled a voice that whispered, "Despair not." Thus did that poor soul wander in want and cheerless comfort, bleeding, barefooted over the shards and thorns of existence. Let me essay, O Muse, to follow the wanderer's footsteps, not through each devious path, each changeful year of existence, but as a traveler follows a streamlet's course through the valley, far from its margin at times, seeing the gleam of its water here and there, in some open space, and at intervals only. Then, drawing nearer its banks through sylvan glooms that conceal it, though he behold it not, he can hear its continuous murmur. Happy at length if he find the spot where it reaches an outlet. 2. It was the month of May, far down the beautiful river, past the Ohio shore, and past the mouth of the Wabash, into the golden stream of the broad and swift Mississippi, floated a cumbrous boat that was rowed by Acadian boatmen. It was a band of exiles, a raft, as it were, from the shipwrecked nation, scattered along the coast, now floating together, bound by the bonds of a common belief and a common misfortune. Men and women and children who, guided by hope or by hearsay, sought for their kith and their kin among the few-acred farmers on the Acadian coast and prairies of fair Opelousas. With them Evangeline went, and her guide, the Father Felician. Onward o'er sunken sands, through a wilderness somber with forests, day after day they glided adown the turbulent river, night after night by their blazing fires, encamped on its borders, now through rushing chutes among green islands where plume-like cotton trees nodded their shadowy crests that swept with the current. Then emerged into broad lagoons where silvery sandbars lay in the stream and along the wimpling waves of their margin. Shining with snow-white plumes, large flocks of pelicans waded. Level the landscape grew, and along the shores of the river, shaded by china trees in the midst of luxuriant gardens, stood the houses of planters with negro cabins and dove cotes. They were approaching the region where reigns perpetual summer, where through the golden coast the groves of orange and citron sweeps with majestic curve the river away to the eastward. They too swerved from their course, and entering the bayou of Plaque, soon were lost in a maze of sluggish and devious waters which, like a network of steel, extended in every direction. Over their heads, the towering and tenebrous boughs of the cypress met a dusky arch, and trailing mosses in mid-air waved like banners that hang on the walls of ancient cathedrals. Deathlike the silence seemed, and unbroken save by the herons, home to their roasts in the cedar trees returning at sunset, or by the owl as he greeted the moon with demonic laughter. Lovely the moonlight was at its glance, and gleamed in the water, gleamed on the columns of cypress and cedars, staining the arches, down through whose broken vaults it fell, as through chinks in a ruin, dreamlike and indistinct, and strange were all things around them, and o'er their spirits there came a feeling of wonder and sadness. Strange forebodings of ill, unseen, and that cannot be compassed. As at the tramp of a horse's hoof on the turf of the prairies, far in advance are closed the leaves of the shrinking mimosa, so at the hoofbeats of fate, with sad forebodings of evil, shrinks and closes the heart ere the stroke of doom has attained it. But Evangeline's heart was sustained by a vision that faintly floated before her eyes and beckoned her on through the moonlight. It was the thought of her brain that assumed the shape of a phantom. Through those shadowy aisles had Gabriel wandered before her, and every stroke of the oar now brought him nearer and nearer. Then in his place at the prow of the boat rose one of the oarsmen, and as a signal sound, if others like them, peradventure, sailed on those gloomy and midnight streams, blew a blast on his bugle, wild through the dark colonnades of corridors, leafy the blast rang, breaking the seal of silence and giving tongues to the forest. Soundless above them, the banners of moss just stirred to the music. Multitudinous echoes awoke and died in the distance, over the watery floor and beneath the reverberant branches. But not a voice replied. No answer came from the darkness, and when the echoes had ceased, like a sense of pain was the silence. Then Evangeline slept, but the boatmen rode through the midnight, silent at times, then singing familiar Canadian boat songs, such as they sang out of their old Acadian rivers. And through the night were heard the mysterious sounds of the desert, far off, indistinct, as of wave or wind in the forest, mixed with the whoop of the crane and the roar of the grim alligator. Thus, ere another noon, they emerged from those shades, and before them lay in the golden sun the lakes of Acadie. Water lakes in myriads rocked on the sunlight undulations, made by the passing made by the passing oars and made by the made by the passing oars and resplendent in beauty. The lotus lifted her golden crown above the heads of the boatsmen, and faint was the air with the odorous breath of magnolia blossoms, and with the heat of noon and numberless sylvan islands, fragrant and thickly embowered with blossoming hedges of roses, near to whose shores they glided along, invited to slumber. Soon by the fairest of these, the weary oars were suspended under the boughs of Wachita willows that grew by the margin,
safely, their boat was moored and scattered about on the greensward. Tired with their midnight toil, the weary travelers slumbered. Over them, vast and high extended the cope of a cedar. Swinging from its great arms, the trumpet flower and the grapevine hung their ladder of ropes aloft, like the ladder of Jacob, on whose pendulous stairs the angels ascending, descending, were the swift humming birds that flitted from blossom to blossom. Such was the vision Evangeline saw as she slumbered beneath it, filled with her heart love and the drawing of opening heaven, lighted her soul in sleep with the glory of regions celestial. Nearer and ever nearer among the numberless islands darted a light, swift boat that sped away over the water. Urged on its course by the sinewy arms of hunters and trappers, northward its prow was turned to the land of the bison and beaver. At the helm sat a youth with countenance thoughtful and careworn. Dark and neglected locks overshadowed his brow, and a sadness somewhat beyond his years on his face was legibly written. Gabriel was it, who, weary with waiting, unhappy and restless, sought in the western wilds oblivion of self and sorrow. Swiftly they guided along, close under the lee on the island. At the opposite of the bank, behind a screen of palmettos, so that they saw not the boat, where it lay concealed in the willows, and undisturbed by the dash of their oars, and unseen, were the sleeper. Angel of God was there, none to awaken the slumbering maiden. Swiftly they guided away like the shade of a cloud on the prairie. After the sound of their oars on the tholes had died in the distance, as from a magic trance the sleepers awoke. The maiden said, with a sigh, to the friendly priest, "O Father Felician, something says in my heart that near me Gabriel wanders. Is it a foolish dream, an idle vague superstition? Or has an angel passed and revealed the truth to my spirit?" Then with a blush she added, "Alas, for my credulous fancy, unto ears like thine such words as these have no meaning." But made no answer the reverend man, and he smiled as he answered, "Daughter, thy words are not idle, nor are they to me without meaning. Feeling is deep and still, and the word that floats on the surface is as the tossing buoy that portrays where the anchor is hidden. Therefore, trust to thy heart, and do what the world calls illusions. Gabriel truly is near thee, for not far away to the southward, on the banks of the Titch, are the towns of St. Maur and St. Martin. There, the long-wandering bride shall be given again to her bridegroom. There the long-absent pastor regain his flock and his sheepfold. Beautiful is the land, with its prairies and forests of fruit trees. Under the feet a garden of flowers, and the bluest of heavens bending above and resting its dome on the walls of the forest. They who dwell there have named it the Eden of Louisiana." With these words of cheer they arose and continued their journey. Softly the evening came. The sun from the western horizon like a magician extended his golden wand o'er the landscape. Twinkling vapors arose, and sky and water and forest seemed all on fire at the touch, and melted and mingled together. Hanging between two skies, a cloud with edges of silver floated the boat with its dripping oars on the motionless water. Filled was Evangeline's heart with inexpressible sweetness, touched by the magic spell. The sacred fountains of feeling glowed with the light of love as the skies and waters around her. Then from a neighboring thicket the mockingbird, wildest of flinging aloft on a willow spray that hung over the water, shook from his little throat such floods of delirious music that the whole air in the woods and the waves seemed silent to listen. Plaintive at first were the tones, and sad, then soaring to the madness seemed they to follow or guide the revival of frenzied bacchantes. Seemed they to follow or guide the revel of frenzied bacchantes. Single notes were then heard in sorrowful low lamentation. till having gathered them all, he flung them abroad in derision, as when after a storm a gust of wind through the treetops shakes down the rattling rain in a crystal shower on the branches. With such a prelude as this, and hearts that throbbed with emotion, slowly they entered the Titch, where it flows through the green up Ulysses, and through the ember air above the crest of the woodland saw the column of smoke that arose from a neighboring dwelling. Sounds of a horn they heard, and the distant lowing of cattle. Part 3. Near to the bank of the river, o'er the shadow by the oaks, from whose branches garlands of Spanish moss and of a mystic mistletoe flaunted, such as the Druids cut down with golden hatchets at Yuletide, stood secluded and still the house of the herdsman, a garden girded and round about it with a belt of luxurious blossoms, filling the air with fragrance. The house itself was of timbers hewn from the cypress tree and carefully fitted together. Large and low was the roof, and on slender columns supported, rose-wreathed, vine-encircled, a broad and spacious veranda, haunt of the hummingbird and the bee, extended around it. At each end of the house, amid the flowers of the garden, stationed the dovecots, were, as love's perpetual symbol, scenes of endless wooing and endless contentions of rivals. Silence reigned over the place. The line of shadow and sunshine reigned near the tree tops, but the house itself was in shadow, and from its chimney top ascending and slowly expanding into the evening air, a thin blue column of smoke arose. In the near of the houses from the garden gate ran a pathway through the great groves of oak to the skirts, or the limitless prairie, into whose sea of flowers the sun was slowly descending. Full in his track of light, like ships with shadowy canvas, hanging loose from their spars in a motionless calm in their tropics, stood a cluster of trees, with tangled cordage and grapevines. Just where the woodlands met the flowery surf of the prairie, mounted upon his horse with Spanish saddle and stirrups, sat a herdsman, arrayed in gaiters and doublet of deerskin. Broad and brown was the face that from under the Spanish sombrero gazed on the peaceful scene, with the lordly look of his master. Round about him were numberless herds of kine that were grazing quietly in the meadows, and breathing the vapory freshness that arose upon the river, and spread itself over the landscape. Slowly lifting the horn that hung at his side and expanding fully his broad, deep chest, he blew a blast that resounded wildly and sweet afar through the still, damp air of the evening. Suddenly, out of the grass, the long white horns of the cattle rose like flakes of foam on the adverse currents of the ocean. Silent, a moment they gazed, then, bellowing, rushed over the prairie. And the whole mass became a cloud, a shade in the distance. Then as the herdsman turned to the house, through the gate, they saw the forms of the priest and the maiden advancing to meet him. Suddenly down from his horse, he sprang in amazement, and forward rushed, with extended arms and exclamations of wonder. When they beheld his face, they recognized Basil. Hearty was his welcome, as he led his guests to the garden. There, in an ardor of roses with endless question and answer, gave they vent to their hearts and renewed their friendly embraces, laughing and weeping by turns, or sitting silent and thoughtful, for Gabriel came not, and now dark doubts and misgivings stole o'er the maiden's heart, and Basil, somewhat embarrassed, broke the silence and said, "If you come by the Achacafalaya, how have you nowhere encountered my Gabriel's boat on the bayous?" Over Evangeline's face at the words of Basil shade passed. Tears came into her eyes, and she said with a tremulous accent, "Gone? Is Gabriel gone?" And concealing her face on his shoulder, all her overburdened heart gave way, and she wept and lamented. Then the good Basil said, and his voice grew blithe as he said it, "Be of good cheer, my child. It is only today he departed. Foolish boy, he has left me alone with my herds and my horses." Moody and restless, grown and tried and troubled, his spirit could no longer endure the calm of this quiet existence. Thinking ever of thee, uncertain and sorrowful, ever silent, or speaking only of thee and his troubles, he at length had become so tedious to men and to maidens, tedious even to me, that at length I bethought me and sent him unto the town of Acadie to trade for mules with the Spaniards. Then he will follow the Indian trails to the Ozark Mountains, hunting for furs in the forests, on rivers, trapping the beaver. Therefore, be of good cheer. We will follow the fugitive lover. He is not far on his way, and the fates and the streams are against him. Up and away tomorrow, and through the red dew of the morning, we will follow him fast and bring him back to his prison. Then glad voices were heard, and up from the banks of the river, borne aloft on his comrade's arms, came Michael the fiddler. Long under Basil's roof had he lived like a god on Olympus, having no other care than dispensing music to mortals. Far renowned was he for his silver locks and his fiddle. "Long live Michael," they cried, "our brave Acadian minstrel," as they bore him aloft in triumphal procession, and straightway Father Felician advanced with Evangeline, greeting the old man kindly and often, recalling the past, while Basil, in rapture, hailed with hilarious joy his old companions and gossips, laughing loud and long, and embracing mothers and daughters. Much they marveled to see the wealth of the sedivant blacksmith, all his domains and his herds and his patriarchal demeanor. Much they marveled to hear his tales of the soil and the climate, and of the prairies whose numberless herds were his, who would take it. Each one thought in his heart that he too would go and do likewise. Thus they ascended the steps, and crossing the airy veranda, entered the hall of the house, where already the supper of Basil waited for his late return, and they rested and feasted together. Over the joyous feast the sudden darkness descended. All was silent without, and an illumining landscape with silver fair rose the dewy moon and myriad stars, but within doors, brighter than these, shone the faces of friends in glimmering lamplight. Then, from his station aloft at the head of the table, the herdsman poured forth his heart and his wine together in endless profusion, lighting his pipe that was filled with sweet Natchitoches tobacco. Thus he spake to his guests, who listened and smiled as they listened. "Welcome once more, my friends, who so long have been friendless and homeless. Welcome once more to a home that is better, perchance, than the old one. Here no hungry winter congeals our blood like the rivers. Here no story ground provokes the wrath of the farmer." Fair was she, and young, when in hope began the long journey. Faded was she, and old, when in disappointment it ended. Each succeeding year stole something away from her beauty, leaving behind it broader and deeper that gloom of the shadow. There appeared and spread faint streaks of gray o'er her forehead, dawn of another life that broke o'er her earthly horizon, as in the eastern sky the first faint streaks of the morning. 5. And that delightful land, which is washed by the Delaware's waters, guarding in sylvan shades the name of Penn the Apostle, stands on the banks of its beautiful stream, the city he founded. There all the air is balm, and the peach is the emblem of beauty, and the streets still re-echo the names of the trees of the forest, as if they fain would appease the dryads whose haunts they molested. There, from the troubled sea, had Evangeline landed in exile, finding among the children of Penn a home in a country. There old Rene LeBlanc had died, and when he departed, saw at his side only one of all his 100 descendants. Something at least there was in the friendly streets of the city, something that spake of her heart, and made no longer her a stranger, and her ear was pleased with thee, and thou of the Quakers, for it recalled the past, the old Acadian country, where all men were equal, and all were brothers and sisters. So when the fruitless search, the disappointed journey ended, to recommence no more upon the earth, uncomplaining, thither as thieves to the light, were turned her thoughts and her footsteps, as from a mountain's top the rainy mists of the morning roll away, and afar we behold the landscape below us, sun illumined with shining rivers and cities and hamlets. So fell the mist from her mind, and she saw the world far below her, dark no longer, but all illumined with love. The pathway which she had climbed so far, lying smooth and fair in the distance. Gabriel was not forgotten. Within her heart was his image, clothed in the beauty of love and youth. At last she beheld him, only more beautiful, made by his death-like silence and absence. Into her thoughts of him time entered not, for it was not. O'er him years had no power. He was not changed, but transfigured. He had become to her heart as one who is dead and not absent. Patience and abnegation of self and devotion to others. This was the lesson a life of trial and sorrow had taught her. So was her love diffused, but like to some odorous spices, suffered no waste nor loss, through filing the air with aroma. Other hope had she none, nor wish in life, but to follow meekly with reverent footsteps the sacred feet of her Savior. Thus many years she lived as a sister of mercy, frequenting lonely and wretched roofs in the crowded lanes of the city, where distress and want concealed themselves from the sunlight, where disease and sorrow in garrets languished neglected. Night after night, when the world was asleep, as the watchman repeated loud through the gusty streets that all was well in the city, high at some lonely window he saw the light of her taper. Day after day, in the gray of the dawn, as slow through the suburbs plodded the German farmer with flowers and fruits for the market. Met he that meek pale face, returning home from its watchings. Then it came to pass that a pestilence fell in the city, presaged by wondrous signs, and mostly by flocks of wild pigeons, darkening the sun in her flight with naught in their craws but an acorn. And as the tides of the sea arise in the month of September, flooding some silver stream till it spreads to a lake in a meadow, so death flooded life, and overflowing its natural margins, spread to a brackish lake, silver stream of existence. Wealth had no power to bribe, nor beauty to charm the oppressor, but all perished alike beneath the scourge of his anger. Only, alas, the poor, who had neither friends nor attendants, crept away to die in the almshouse, home of the homeless. Then in the suburbs it stood, in the midst of meadows and woodlands. Now the city surrounds it, but still, with its gateway and wicket meek, in the midst of splendor, its humble wails seem to echo softly the words of the Lord. The poor ye always have with you. Thither by night and by day came the sister of mercy. The dying looked up into her face and thought, indeed, To behold there gleams of celestial light encircle her forehead with splendor, such as the artist paints o'er the brows of saints and apostles, or such as hangs by night o'er a city seen at a distance. Unto their eyes it seemed the lamps of the city celestial, into whose shining gates ere long their spirits would enter. Thus on a Sabbath morn, through the streets, deserted and silent, wending her quiet way, she entered the door of the almshouse. Sweet on the summer air was the odor of flowers in the garden, and she paused on her way to gather the fairest among them, that the dying once more might rejoice in their fragrance and beauty. Then, as she mounted the stairs to the corridors, cooled by the east wind, distant and soft on her ear fell the chimes from the belfry of Christ Church, while intermingled with these, across the meadows were wafted sounds of psalms that were sung by the Swedes in their church of Wicca. Soft and ascending wings fell the calm of the house, her spirit. Something within her said, "At length thy trials are ended." And with a light in her looks she entered the chambers of sickness. Noisily moved about the assiduous, careful attendants, moistening the feverish lip and the aching brow. And in silence, closing the sightless eye of the dead and concealing their faces where on the pallets they lay, like drifts of snow by the roadside, many a languid head upraised as Evangeline entered, turned on its pillow of pain to gaze while she passed, for her presence fell on their hearts like a ray of the sun on the walls of a prison. As she looked around, she saw how Death, the consoler, laying his hand upon many a heart, had healed it forever. Many familiar forms had disappeared in the nighttime, vacant their places were, or filled already by strangers. Suddenly, as if arrested by fear or a feeling of wonder, still she stood, with her colorless lips apart, while a shudder ran through her frame, and forgotten the flowerets dropped from her fingers and from her eyes and cheeks the light of bloom of the morning. Then there escaped from her lips a cry of such terrible anguish that the dying heard it, and started up from their pillows. Only the pallet before her was stretched the form of an old man. Long and thin and gray were the locks that shaded his temples, but as he lay in the morning light, his face for a moment seemed to assume once more the forms of its earlier manhood. So are wont to be changed the faces of those who are dying. Hot and red on his lips still burned the flush of the fever, as if life, like the Hebrew, with blood had besprinkled its portals, that the angel of death might see the sign and pass over. Motionless and senseless, dying he lay, and his spirit, exhausted, seemed to be sinking down to infinite depths of the darkness of slumber and death, forever sinking and sinking. Then through those realms of shade, in multiplied reverberations, heard he that cry of pain, and through the hush that succeeded, whispered a gentle voice in accents tender and saint-like, "Gabriel, O my beloved," and died away into the silence. Then he beheld in a dream once more the home of his childhood, green Acadian meadows with sylvan rivers among them, village and mountain and woodlands, and walking under their shadows in the days of her youth, Evangeline rose in his vision. Tears came into his eyes, and as slowly he lifted his eyelids, vanished the vision away. But Evangeline knelt by his bedside. Vainly he strove to whisper her name, for the accents unuttered died on his lips, and their motion revealed what his tongue would have vainly he strove to arise. Evangeline, kneeling beside him, kissed his dying lips and laid his head on her bosom. Sweet was the light of his eyes, but it suddenly sank into darkness, as when a lamp is blown out by a gust of wind at a casement. All was ended now, the hope and the fear and the sorrow, all the aching of heart, the restlessness, unsatisfied longing, all the dull, deep pain and constant anguish of patience. And as she pressed once more the lifeless head to her bosom, meekly she bowed her own and murmured, "Father, I thank thee." Still stands the forest primeval, but far away from its shadow, side by side in their nameless graves, the lovers are sleeping. Under the humble walls of the little Catholic churchyard in the heart of the city they lie, unknown and unnoticed. Daily the tides of life go ebbing and flowing beside them. Thousands of throbbing hearts where theirs are at rest and forever. Thousands of aching brains where theirs no longer are busy. Thousands of toiling hands where theirs have ceased from the labors. Thousands of weary feet where theirs have completed their journey. Still stands the forest primeval, but under the shade of its branches dwells another race, with other customs and language. Only along the shore of the mournful and misty Atlantic linger a few Acadian peasants whose fathers from exile wandered back to their native land to die in its bosom. In the fisherman's cot, the wheel and the loom are still busy. Maidens still wear their Norman caps and their kirtles of homespun. And by the evening fire repeat Evangeline's story, while from its rocky caverns the deep-voiced neighboring ocean speaks, and in accents disconsolate answers the wall of the forest.